Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Azrin, the language nerd here, owner of the Calgary Language Nerds, making this piece of content for you from my car using my phone. I will not transcribe. I will download the audio from this and turn this into a podcast episode too. So I've made a lot of content over the past 7 years about language learning. I've made videos and podcasts, I've written blog posts, I've made micro content on social media platforms, and I've been asked a couple of times over the past 7 years to write a book, to essentially condense my language learning advice into one single place that's easy for people to consume. I'm not writing a book. However, I do think it's a good idea to have a single place where my language learning advice is condensed and compiled. It's easier to consume that way. You don't have to consume thousands and thousands of videos and audios and such to get the gist of what kinds of language learning advice I have. So I'm working on a web page right now. I want to put it probably directly on my website, azrinthelanguagenerd.com, where I can put something like my top language learning tips. And so today is the start of that project. And I'd like to share one of my favorite pieces of advice when it comes to trying to progress faster when learning another language. Obviously, there are a lot of ways you can progress faster in another language. You could optimize your language learning methods. There are a number of things you can do, but one of my favorite things, one of the foolproof general pieces of advice I can give that applies to a very high percentage of people is maximizing how much time you spend on learning a language. If we take two people, person A and person B, person A is spending, 3 hours a week learning Spanish. Person B is spending 6 hours a week on learning Spanish. It is highly likely that person B is going to progress faster than person A. Obviously, I understand there are other factors. The amount of time you spend learning a language is not the only factor that needs to be considered, but it is one significant factor. It's my belief that the amount of time you spend on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis to try to learn a language is at least as important as the methods you are using to try to learn a language. So it's a very big part of the equation. Now, I embody this belief personally in my language learning studies. One way I do so is by doing intensive studies, which I've talked about frequently in my content. I will do intensive studies by traveling abroad and basically studying another language full time. This could be by taking classes. In fact, it's usually a mixture of taking classes and immersing myself in the local culture. But I've also done intensive studies even in my hometown, here in Calgary, where I live. And I might sign up for a certain number of classes per day and then make sure I'm consuming lots of content in the language I'm learning. But for me, I have noticed every time I've done intensive studies, and I've noticed this with other people too, it's not just me, but when I do intensive studies, I see this rapid progress, where in a 6-week window, I progress way more than I did even in the previous year of studies, for example. In fact, the other benefit I've seen from, for example, intensive studies, or even just maximizing how much time I spend on language learning, is I've been able to take, I would call them subpar learning methods, and still make them work quite well. I'll give you an example. I speak Mandarin. I'm also able to read and write, read in Mandarin. My writing is actually not that great, but I can read in Mandarin, both simplified and traditional characters. In the initial phases of me learning Mandarin, I did not learn to read or write at all. In fact, I remember I was taking a class where I would fail every single reading and writing portion of my test because I spent essentially no time on reading and writing. Now, in 2015, I went to Beijing, and I decided that I wanted to be able to read at least to an extent. The fact that I couldn't read was impeding me in day-to-day life. I would go to restaurants and I couldn't read the menus, for instance. So the method that I used to try to teach myself to read was I would look at characters and try to memorize the shape of the characters. I would try to just look at it and memorize all the lines. There are so many other ways to learn to read that are far more effective than just staring at characters and trying to memorize them. There are way more effective methods. But because I spent so much time just looking at characters, trying to memorize what they look like, because I spent so much time on it, I made a lot of progress. My reading ability improved relatively quickly, I would say. At least it improved at a rate that I was somewhat happy with at a minimum. So to summarize this video here, / podcast if you're just listening, one very effective way to expedite your progress in another language is to maximize how much time you spend on learning that language on a day-by-day and week-by-week basis. You can do intensive studies if you want to, where you're studying multiple hours a day for X number of weeks, or you can just try to figure out how do you fit in more time. How do you dedicate more time on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis to learning a language? You can really look at it in any one of those two ways. Obviously, the amount of time you spend is not the only factor to how quickly you're going to progress in a language, but it is one very important factor. And if you do maximize that time, it is highly probable that you are going to progress a heck of a lot faster. If you're spending more time on learning a language, one thing that's really cool is you can take subpar learning methods and still make them work. My personal experience has shown me that for my personal language learning studies. And I think that for many of you watching, you can have a similar experience as well. If you have any questions on this, feel free to let me know. You can contact me on any social media platform, or even easier, go to azrenthelanguagenerd.com/contact. That's AZ or ZREN, thelanguagenerd.com/contact. And you can see all my social media platforms there. You can email me from there, whatever you prefer. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll chat soon. Bye-bye.